The palomino horse had been waiting in Joseph Covington's corral for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days when Augusta Baker finally rode into Dusty Creek, Texas, on a borrowed mule with nothing but a leather satchel, a grief-worn heart and her father's name on her lips. Joseph had not expected anyone to come. After 3 years, a reasonable man would have sold the animal, put the money toward fence posts or winter grain, and called it good conscience. Joseph Covington was not always a reasonable man. He was, however, a patient one, and there was something about the palomino, about the way the horse had arrived riderless and foaming at the mouth on a cold November morning in 1878, that told him to wait. A horse like that had a story. Stories deserved endings. The town of Dusty Creek in 1880, one was a scrappy collection of ambitions and failures pressed together along a single main road that turned to mud in the rain and dust in the drought, which meant it was either mud or dust for roughly 10 months of the year. There was a general store run by a widow named Mrs. Calloway who kept her prices fair and her opinions sharp. There was a saloon called the Copper Penny where honest men drank alongside dishonest ones, and sometimes you could not tell the difference until morning. There was a church with a cracked bell that rang flat on Sundays, a livery stable, a blacksmith, a land office, and a small schoolhouse that doubled as a courthouse on the occasions Dusty Creek required one. Joseph Covington's ranch sat 2 miles east of town, pressed up against a ridge of limestone that turned amber in the late afternoon light. He ran cattle, grew some feed corn, and kept a modest stable. He was 28 years old in the spring of 1881, brown as saddle leather from working outdoors, with dark eyes that had a habit of noticing things other people walked right past. He had no wife, a fact the women of Dusty Creek's small congregation found both troubling and mildly hopeful. He had a hired hand named Cletus Dre, who was 53 and had opinions about weather that were rarely correct, and a dog named Pepper who slept under the porch and barked at shadows. Augusta Baker arrived on a Wednesday in late April, when the bluebonnets were doing their level best along the roadside, and the sky was the particular shade of blue that only exists in Texas in spring. She rode that borrowed mule straight to the sheriff's office because that was the only logical place she could think to start, and she asked the man behind the desk if he had ever heard of a palomino horse belonging to a man named Elias Baker, deceased, of San Antonio by way of Abilene. Sheriff Dexter Potts was a broad, slow-moving man who had the deliberate quality of someone who had learned long ago that most problems solved themselves if you gave them enough time. He leaned back in his chair, let it creak under his considerable weight, and said that yes, he had in fact heard of that horse, and that the man who had it was Joseph Covington, and that she ought to ride east on the main road until she hit a limestone ridge and then turn left at the old oak tree. Augusta thanked him, returned to her mule, and kept her face composed until she was out of view of the sheriff's window, at which point she pressed her hand flat against her chest and drew a long, shaking breath. 3 years she had been searching. 3 years of letters unanswered, of dead ends and wrong turns, of people who had seen a palomino and could not remember where, of a grief so specific and so complete that it had taken up permanent residence in her rib cage like a stone she carried everywhere she went. Her father, Elias Baker, had died in November of 1878, which was the same month the palomino had arrived at Joseph Covington's ranch. Elias had ridden out from San Antonio on what he described in a letter to Augusta as a quick matter of business he expected to resolve within a fortnight. Augusta had been in Abilene at the time, staying with her mother's sister, a severe but not unkind woman named Harriet, helping her through a difficult winter. The letter had been the last thing Elias Baker ever wrote to his daughter. He had died of a fever in a small settlement 40 miles south of Dusty Creek, taken in by a family who did their best for him, and buried in a plot that Augusta had only learned about through a chain of correspondence that had taken nearly 2 years to complete. The horse, Elias' beloved palomino named Solomon, had apparently spooked during the man's illness and run. He had found his way to Joseph Covington's corral, and Joseph had kept him. Augusta had learned this only recently, through a letter from a man in the settlement who had finally responded to her inquiry, and who had spoken to the Covington ranch as though it were a landmark. She rode out to the limestone ridge. She turned left at the old oak tree. She came up the long, gentle slope toward a whitewashed fence and a house that was not grand but was clearly tended with care, and she saw the palomino standing in the corral as if he had simply been waiting for the world to catch up to him. Solomon saw her at the same moment she saw him. The horse lifted his head and his ears came forward, and he gave a low, resonant sound that was not quite a whinny and not quite a sigh, but something in between, something that registered in Augusta's chest like a bell being struck. She was off the mule before she had fully decided to dismount, walking quickly across the dusty yard toward the fence, and she got both hands on the top rail and said his name out loud for the first time in 3 years and promptly burst into tears. She was still crying, in a quiet and slightly mortified way, when the sound of boots on packed earth made her aware that she was not alone in the yard. Joseph Covington had been in the barn when he heard the unfamiliar sound of a mule coming up the road. He had come out expecting a neighbor or a passing traveler, and instead found a woman of perhaps 24 or 25 standing at Solomon's corral, weeping with one hand pressed to her mouth as if she could contain it. She was wearing a dark blue dress that had seen better days and a broad-brimmed hat with the dust of considerable travel on it, and her hair was coming loose from its pins in a way that suggested the journey had been long and the mule not particularly smooth-gaited. He stopped a respectful distance away and said, "Ma'am, are you all right?" She turned and he saw her face properly for the first time. It was a striking face, not in the conventional way that people sometimes described women in drawing rooms, but in the way of someone who had both felt things deeply and survived them. Her eyes were reddened from crying and brown and direct in a manner that he found immediately arresting. "I apologize," she said, and her voice was steadier than he expected. "I am Augusta Baker. Elias Baker was my father. I believe you have his horse." Joseph felt something shift inside him, some quiet thing that had been waiting without knowing it was waiting. He said, "Yes, ma'am, I have his horse. I am Joseph Covington. I have been keeping him for you." "You did not know I was coming," she said, which was not an accusation but an observation. "No," he agreed, "but I thought someone would. A horse like Solomon does not belong to just anyone." She looked at him for a moment, and then she looked at the horse, and then she said in a voice that was both grateful and grieving, "He named him Solomon because he said the horse had more wisdom than most men he had met." Joseph said, "I believe that is probably true of this particular horse," and she laughed, which surprised them both. He invited her inside for coffee, which was the hospitable thing to do, and she accepted because she had been riding since before dawn, and the mule had not been sympathetic company. The house was clean in the sparse and functional way of a man living alone, who has nonetheless been raised to respect his surroundings. There were books on a shelf beside the fireplace, which she noticed, and there was a photograph in a small frame on the mantel that she did not comment on. She sat at his kitchen table and wrapped her hands around a tin cup and told him about her father, about the letter, about the 2 years of searching, and about the final letter that had led her here. Joseph listened the way he did most things, with complete attention and without interrupting, and when she finished he said, "I am sorry about your father, Miss Baker. He must have been a good man. Solomon is not a horse that suffers fools." "He was a very good man," she said, and then, because she had said it simply and plainly rather than with the elaborate performance that grief sometimes required, it sat comfortably between them. "Where will you go now?" he asked. "Have you arrangements in town?" She had not made arrangements. She had only known she needed to get to Dusty Creek and find Solomon, and beyond that her plans were the approximate consistency of morning fog. She had enough money to stay a few days at whatever passed for a boarding house in Dusty Creek, and then she needed to think about what came next, which was a sentence she had been avoiding thinking about for approximately 3 years. Joseph said that Mrs. Calloway sometimes took in boarders and that he could vouch for her, and Augusta said that would be very helpful. He also said that Solomon was in good health, that he had been exercised regularly and fed well, and that she was welcome to come out to the ranch any time she liked to visit before she was ready to travel home. She asked where home was, and then realized she had asked as though she were making conversation when in fact she was genuinely curious. He said the ranch was home. He had been born in Georgia and come west at 19 after the war had taken enough from his family that staying felt like watching someone slowly drain all the water from a vessel that could not be refilled. She said, "I am sorry," because she understood about vessels. He said, "It is all right. Texas is a better fit for me, I think." She went to Mrs. Calloway's boarding house that evening and took a small, clean room with a window that faced west, which meant she could see the sun go down over the plains in a blaze of orange and red that was frankly extravagant. She ate supper at Mrs. Calloway's table with two other boarders, a traveling salesman named Perkins who talked too much about weather systems, and a quiet schoolteacher named Miss Drew who was passing through on her way to a posting in Laredo. Augusta thought about Joseph Covington's dark eyes and his careful listening, and the way he had said, "I have been keeping him for you," as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She went back to the ranch the next morning, telling herself it was to see Solomon, which was true. Solomon greeted her with unmistakable recognition, pressing his nose against her palm and blowing a warm breath across her wrist, and she stood in the morning sun and felt something inside her begin the slow process of unknotting. Joseph was mending a section of fence along the north side of the property when she arrived, and he waved her toward the corral and said to make herself at home, which she did. After a while he came back and they stood together at the fence, and he told her about the morning Solomon had arrived, how the horse had been wild-eyed and exhausted and had nonetheless stood still long enough for Joseph to examine him, as if the animal had understood that cooperation was required. "How did you know to keep him?" she asked. "You could have sold him." "I could have," he agreed. "The thought crossed my mind once or twice, especially the first winter when hay prices were unreasonable. But every time I looked at him, I thought about whoever was missing him, and I could not bring myself to do it." Augusta looked at him sideways. "That is an extraordinarily patient thing to do, Mr. Covington." "Joseph," he said, "please. Mr. Covington was my father and he was a complicated man." She smiled at that. "Augusta, then." The name in his mouth felt like a small ceremony. Over the next several days, Augusta fell into an unexpected rhythm. She would come out to the ranch in the mornings, spend time with Solomon, and inevitably end up staying longer than she planned because Joseph would say something interesting or show her something about the land that made her see it differently, and the morning would become afternoon before either of them fully accounted for it. Cletus Dre, the hired hand, watched all of this with the tolerant expression of a man who had seen things develop at their own pace and knew better than to speed them along. On the third day, Augusta asked Joseph if she could ride Solomon, and he said of course. The horse was hers, and she went out across the limestone ridges with the palomino moving under her like a memory made physical, and she cried again, but this time quietly and into the wind, and it felt less like grief and more like release. Joseph saw her come back with her chin up and her eyes bright, and something changed in his expression, something that Cletus noticed from 40 yards away and stored in his memory with the satisfaction of a man who is occasionally right about something important. That evening, Joseph asked Augusta if she would like to stay for supper, and she said yes, and they ate beans and cornbread and talked about books, which they had both been doing in isolation, and which was considerably more interesting to do with another person. She had read Darwin and found him challenging and uncomfortable and ultimately convincing. He had read Twain and found him funny and true and sad in the way that things are sometimes all three at once. She said, "You are not what I expected to find in Dusty Creek, Texas." He said, "What did you expect?" She considered this honestly. "I expected someone older, I think. someone who had kept the horse out of inertia rather than intention. He said it was intention from the first morning. She asked him what had made him so certain someone would come, and he was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was thinking rather than stalling. And then he said, "Because a horse like Solomon makes it clear he belongs somewhere specific. And things that belong somewhere specific always find their way back, or the place finds its way to them." Augusta looked at him across the table in the lamplight and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, something warm and terrifying and entirely inconvenient, given that she had a mule borrowed from Harriet's neighbor and a return journey of 3 days ahead of her. She stayed another week. It was not a decision she made all at once. It was a series of small decisions that accumulated the way creek water accumulates behind a beaver dam, gradually and then all at once. She wrote to Harriet explaining that she had found Solomon and that she was attending to some business matters before returning, which was technically true if you counted the business of gradually realizing that the rest of your life might be happening in a place you had not expected. Joseph drove her into town on the 4th day to collect a package at the general store, and she met Mrs. Calloway properly, and the sheriff, and the blacksmith whose name was Hank and who had enormous forearms and very gentle manners, and a woman named Ruth Prescott who ran a small dressmaking operation out of the back of her house, and who looked at Augusta with immediate and frank appraisal and said, "Joseph Covington brought you into town, did he?" Augusta said. "He offered a ride. His horse was going the same direction as my feet." Ruth Prescott smiled in the way of someone who knew exactly how horses and feet conspired. "He is a good man," she said simply. "One of the genuine ones. They are not as common as they ought to be out here." Augusta thought about that for a long time. On the 6th day, Joseph asked her to ride out with him to check on the cattle grazing up on the north pasture, and she went. And they rode side by side through the spring grass for an hour without talking much, which was its own kind of conversation. The sky was enormous in that particular way that Texas sky is enormous, as though the land had decided that if it could not be as dramatic as mountains, it would simply go on forever in every direction. At the top of the ridge, they stopped and looked out across the valley, and Joseph said, "When I first came here, I thought the emptiness would drive me out of my mind. I was used to Georgia where everything is crowded up against everything else." "And now?" she asked. "Now I think the space is the point," he said. "You can see what's coming. You can see the weather building from 30 miles away. You can see the herd from here, every head." He gestured at the vista. "There are no surprises you have not had time to prepare for." Augusta was quiet for a moment. "My father used to say that Solomon could see around corners," she said. "He meant it as a compliment. He said the horse always knew before the rider what was coming on the road." "He probably does," Joseph said. "Horses have a different kind of knowing." "He has been waiting for me," she said, and it came out quietly as though she were still deciding what she meant by it. "All this time he has just been here." "Yes," Joseph said. She turned and looked at him, and he was looking back at her, and the space between them on horseback in the spring sunshine had the quality of something about to become something else. "You kept him," she said, "for 3 years, without knowing if anyone would come." 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days, he said, and then looked slightly alarmed at having said it so precisely, as though he had revealed something he had not entirely meant to reveal. She stared at him. "You counted." He looked at the valley. "I kept track of how long I had been feeding him, as a practical matter. Joseph Covington," she said, and there was something in the way she said his name, the full name, that made him look at her again. "You counted every day." He said, "I may have done." She did not say anything else for a moment, and then she said, "I am glad it was you who found him." He said, "So am I," and meant something considerably larger than the horse. They rode back in the early afternoon, and Cletus Dray was waiting at the barn, with the expression of a man who has conclusively been right about something, and is managing his satisfaction with great dignity. On the 7th day, Augusta told Joseph that she needed to think about going home, and the word home came out with a hollow ring that made them both hear it the same way, which was to say like a bell that no longer has the right shape for the sound it is supposed to make. He said, "Where is home exactly, Augusta? You mentioned Abilene and San Antonio both." She said, "My aunt's house in Abilene. I have been staying there since my father died. It is kind and I am grateful, but it is not mine." He looked at her directly. "What would yours look like?" It was either a very simple question or a very complicated one, and she recognized that the answer she gave would matter. She said, "I'm not certain yet, but I think I am beginning to have an idea." He said, "Augusta," and stopped. She waited. He said, "I would not want you to feel any kind of obligation on account of Solomon. The horse is yours, and I will help you make arrangements to transport him however best suits your plans. You do not owe me anything." She said, "I know that." He said, "I just want to be clear." She said, "Joseph, I have been coming to your ranch every morning for a week. I have eaten supper at your table twice. I have told you more about my father than I have told anyone since he died. I do not think this is about obligation." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No." "I suppose it is not," she said. "What is it then?" He said, "I am not certain, but I would like the chance to find out if you are willing." She said, "I am willing." The following Sunday, Joseph drove Augusta to the church with the flat-ringing bell, and they sat in the third row from the back because that was where Joseph always sat, and she sat beside him with their shoulders occasionally touching when the congregation settled together on the wooden bench, and several people looked at them with various degrees of interest and approval. After the service, Mrs. Calloway invited them both to Sunday dinner along with Ruth Prescott and her husband, a taciturn man named George who had strong opinions about cattle breeds and almost no opinions about anything else, which made him a remarkably easy dinner guest. They ate roast chicken and potatoes and apple pie, and Augusta found herself laughing more than she had in 3 years at something Cletus Dre said. He had also been invited, at Joseph's insistence, about a particularly obstinate mule he had once owned. "It sounds like my borrowed mule," Augusta said. "Mules have a philosophy," Cletus said sagely. "They believe that moving quickly is rarely worth the effort, and on reflection I am not always certain they are wrong." Joseph looked at Augusta across the table and she looked back at him, and the laugh they shared felt like something being built together, one moment at a time. On Monday morning, Augusta wrote a letter to her Aunt Harriet. It was a longer letter than she had originally planned, and she revised it twice, and the final version said that she had found Solomon and that she was in good health, and that she had met someone she would like Harriet to know about, and that she was not certain when she would be returning to Abilene, but that she would write again soon with more news. She also wrote to a lawyer in San Antonio regarding her father's estate, which had been in a state of unresolved documentation for 3 years, to inform him of her current address in Dusty Creek. She did this at Mrs. Calloway's kitchen table while Mrs. Calloway made bread, and did not ask questions, but hummed contentedly in a way that suggested she was well informed already. Joseph was not idle during this time. He was a man who took things seriously, which sometimes meant he took them slowly, but when he had decided on a direction, he committed to it with the particular gravity of someone who does not change course without excellent reason. He had a conversation with Cletus Dre that was ostensibly about a fence line and was actually about something else entirely, and Cletus said, "Son, I have been watching you walk around that corral looking at that horse and thinking about that woman for a week. I believe you know what you want. The question is what you are going to do about it." Joseph said, "I do not want to rush her. She has been through a great deal." Cletus said, "There is a difference between rushing and making your intentions known. A woman who has ridden a borrowed mule 3 days to find a horse is not a woman who is afraid of commitment. She is a woman who goes after what matters." Joseph considered this for a long time. On Thursday, which was 12 days after Augusta had first arrived in Dusty Creek, Joseph rode into town in the early afternoon, tied his horse at the post in front of Mrs. Calloway's, knocked on the door, and asked Augusta if she would like to go for a walk. She said yes and got her hat. They walked out to the edge of town, where the main road gave way to open range, and the grass moved in the afternoon wind, and the limestone ridges in the distance turned gold in the lowering sun. He walked with his hands in his pockets, and she walked with her arms swinging slightly at her sides, and for a while they simply walked. He said, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it without any pressure attached to it, because I mean it plainly and not as a proposition." She said, "All right." He said, "I think you are the most remarkable person I have met in a very long time. I think you are brave in a way that does not announce itself loudly but is simply there, in the way you carry things. I think when you laugh it changes the quality of the air around you. And I think that I have been alone on that ranch for several years without fully understanding that anything was missing, and now that you have been here for nearly 2 weeks I understand it very well." Augusta stopped walking. He stopped too. She looked at him with the direct brown eyes that had arrested his attention on the first day, and she said, "That was not nothing, Joseph, that was considerable." "I said I meant it plainly," he said. She said, "I heard you. I am deciding how to respond." He waited. He was good at waiting. She said, "I came to Dusty Creek for a horse. I did not come looking for anything else. But I have been thinking about something you said on the ridge, about how in open country you can see things coming from 30 miles away. I think I can see something coming, and I am not afraid of it." He said, "Augusta," she said, "I am not finished," but she was smiling. "I think you are someone worth knowing better. I think this town is somewhere I could be, which surprises me because I was not planning to be anywhere in particular. I think Solomon knows something we are only beginning to understand." He said, "What does Solomon know?" She said, "That he is home." Joseph looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, which was a simple thing, a careful thing, a thing that required no words and used them anyway in all the ways that matter. And they stood at the edge of Dusty Creek with the wind coming off the open range, and the light going gold and amber and something beginning between them that was already too large and too real to be put back. He said, "I would like the chance to court you properly if you will allow it." She said, "I will allow it." He said, "I should warn you that I am not always graceful about it. I am better at doing than at saying." She said, "I have noticed you are very good at doing. You kept a horse for over 3 years on the principle that someone would eventually come to claim him. That is the most romantic thing I have ever heard anyone do, and you did not even know you were doing it." He said, "I was not thinking of it as romantic." She said, "What were you thinking of it as?" He said, "Right." She squeezed his hand once, and they walked back toward town in the amber evening. And the conversation they had on the way was ordinary in the best possible sense, about the ranch and about Abilene, and about what Solomon ate for breakfast, and about whether Cletus Dre's weather predictions were actually as bad as he claimed. And it was the kind of conversation that two people have when they are building something real and are comfortable enough to build it out of ordinary materials. Over the following weeks, Dusty Creek observed the courtship of Joseph Covington and Augusta Baker with the attentiveness of a small community that knows it is watching something worth watching. Joseph came to Mrs. Calloway's 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes for supper, sometimes simply to walk with Augusta in the evenings. Augusta rode out to the ranch regularly, working with Solomon, and sometimes riding out with Joseph to check the cattle or inspect the north fence or simply ride, which was its own pleasure. There were dinners at Ruth Prescott's. There was a dance at the schoolhouse in May where Joseph danced exactly as he had warned, which was with enormous earnestness and only moderate coordination. And Augusta danced with him anyway and found the earnestness considerably more appealing than elegance would have been. There was a rainstorm in early June that caught them both out in the open when they had been riding, and they took shelter in a stand of oaks and stood very close together listening to the rain hammer the leaves overhead and talking about their fathers, both of whom were gone now, and what it meant to carry the people who shaped you into a world they would never see. Augusta's father had been a traveling merchant, she explained, a man who was more comfortable moving than staying, who had loved her fiercely and from considerable distance, who had sent money and letters and occasionally himself, and whose death had left a silence she was still learning the shape of. Joseph's father had been a Georgia farmer who had not survived the aftermath of the war hole, who had died a few years later of something that did not have a name on the death certificate, but which Joseph understood to be the accumulated weight of loss. Both of their fathers had been complicated men who had loved their children imperfectly and genuinely, and they stood in the rain shelter of the oaks and acknowledged this without needing to explain it further. He put his arm around her shoulders in the rain, and she leaned against him, and neither of them said anything more for a while, and the silence was full of something warm and complete. In June, a letter arrived for Augusta from the lawyer in San Antonio. Her father's estate had finally been settled, and while it was not a large estate, there was a modest sum and the deed to a small property in San Antonio that her father had owned, which she had not known about. She sat with the letter at Mrs. Calloway's table for a long time before she showed it to Joseph. He read it carefully and said, "What will you do?" she said. "I do not need the property. I can sell it." She looked at him. "I think I would rather invest in something closer to here." He looked up from the letter. She said, "If there is something to invest in." He said, "Augusta, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it without any rush. I'm not asking because of the estate or because of the property or because of anything practical. I am asking because every morning I wake up and the first thing I think about is whether I will see you today, and that has been true for 2 months, and I believe it will be true for the rest of my life." She put her hand on the table, and he put his hand over hers. He said, "I would like you to marry me. I would like you to stay here in Dusty Creek on the ranch, and I would like Solomon to be in the corral, and I would like to build something here that is ours together. I know it is not a grand life. The house needs work and the north fence is a constant problem, and Cletus has opinions about everything and is wrong about the weather consistently. But it is genuine and it is mine, and I would like it to be yours too." Augusta looked at him across the table in the morning light coming through Mrs. Calloway's kitchen window, and she thought about the palomino horse standing in the corral for 3 years, and she thought about riding 3 days on a borrowed mule, and she thought about her father, who had always been moving toward something and had never quite arrived, and she thought about herself, who had been doing the same thing since he died. She said, "Joseph." "Yes." He said, "Yes." She said, "Yes, all of it. The house and the fence and Cletus and his incorrect weather. Yes." He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant something was very full inside him, and then he said, "Thank you," very quietly, and she understood that he meant something enormous by it. Mrs. Calloway, who had been in the back pantry and who had heard every word, emerged with elaborate casualness and put a fresh pot of coffee on the stove and did not say anything. But she was smiling in a way that suggested the bread she was going to bake that morning was going to be the best bread she had made all year. The wedding was in July, at the flat-belled church on a morning when the sky was cloudless and the heat was not yet at its peak, and the bluebonnets had given way to the bright yellow of black-eyed Susans along the road. The whole town came, which was the way of small towns, where a wedding is a community event, and everyone has an opinion about the flowers and the food and the music. Ruth Prescott made Augusta a dress of ivory cotton with small blue flowers on the bodice, which she had done in 3 weeks of focused work, and which was the most beautiful thing Augusta had ever worn. Cletus Dre wore his good coat, which had last been worn at an occasion he refused to specify, and he sat in the front row on the groom's side and looked profoundly satisfied with the universe. Joseph stood at the altar in his best shirt and a jacket he had bought from the traveling dry goods merchant who had come through town the week before, and he looked at Augusta walking up the aisle between the rough wooden pews, and his expression was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on a human face, open and certain and deeply glad. The Reverend read the words. They said their vows. When Joseph kissed her, it was careful and deliberate, and the church made the particular sound of a room full of people who are genuinely happy for two other people, which is a sound that does not happen as often as it should but is unmistakable when it does. They went back to the ranch as husband and wife, which was a sentence that required several days to feel entirely real, and which felt more real every morning. The house did need work, as Joseph had honestly advertised. The roof over the back bedroom leaked in heavy rain, which they discovered in August, and there was a section of the kitchen floor that was warped from an old water damage that needed replacing, and the barn needed new boards along the west wall. But Augusta had not married a grand house. She had married a man, and the man was solid in all the ways that mattered, and the house became something different entirely once there were two people inside it who were paying attention to each other. She took over the kitchen with a focused energy that surprised Joseph, who had been eating his own cooking for years, and had reduced his standards to the point where anything that was edible was excellent. Augusta could bake bread that made the house smell like something worth coming home to, and she made a chicken stew that Cletus Dre declared superior to anything he had eaten since leaving Tennessee, which was 30 years of comparison. She also had ideas about the ranch, which she shared carefully, knowing that opinions about a man's land and livelihood require a certain kind of invitation. But Joseph invited them explicitly, sitting at the kitchen table after supper and saying, "You have a good eye for things." "What do you see?" she said. "I think you could expand the vegetable garden and sell the surplus to Mrs. Calloway for the store. The soil on the east side of the house is very good. And I think there is space in the barn for 2 more horses if you rearrange the stalls, which would let you take in horses for boarding from town, since the livery is always full." He listened to all of it. He implemented most of it over the following months, gradually, in the way he did everything, and the results were quietly significant. The vegetable garden became a small but reliable income. The boarding arrangement brought in 3 additional horses through the fall, which paid for the roof repair and the kitchen floor. Solomon moved through all of this with the calm authority of an animal who has seen enough change to understand that change itself is not the problem. He greeted Augusta every morning when she came out to the corral, and he tolerated Joseph with the dignified acceptance of a horse who has understood that this particular human is all right. Autumn came to the Texas Hill Country in long, slow colors, the way it does when you are somewhere with room for it to spread out. The mornings turned cool, and the evenings turned gold, and the cattle grew their winter coats, and Augusta and Joseph settled into the rhythms of a shared life with the ease of 2 people who had both been living alone long enough to appreciate exactly what they were no longer doing. There were small frictions, as there are always small frictions. Augusta had strong opinions about the placement of furniture that Joseph had put where it was because it had always been there. Joseph had a habit of leaving his boots exactly inside the front door, where they constituted a navigation, hazard that Augusta addressed 3 times before simply moving them to the porch, which resolved the matter permanently. He was sometimes quiet in a way that she had to learn to read, distinguishing between the quiet of a man who was simply thinking and the quiet of a man who had something he was not yet saying, and she learned the difference with the same patience he applied to most things. One evening in October, sitting by the fire after supper while the wind came off the ridge and Pepper snored under the porch, Augusta said, "I want to talk to you about something." He put down his book and gave her his full attention. She said, "I want to write to Harriet and ask her to visit. She was my father's sister by marriage, and she was kind to me when I had nowhere else to go, and I think she deserves to know where I have landed. But I want to make sure you are comfortable with it first." He said, "Of course she should visit. Invite her for as long as she likes." Augusta said, "She is not a particularly easy guest." He said, "I have Cletus." "I have experience with people who are not easy," she laughed. "That is not entirely fair to Cletus." "No," he agreed. "Cletus is rarely wrong about cattle, just weather." Harriet came in November, which was an arrival of some logistical complexity since Harriet did not travel lightly or without complaint, but she arrived nonetheless, and she examined the ranch and the house and Joseph with the systematic thoroughness of a woman who takes her obligations seriously. She sat with Joseph on the porch the second morning and asked him directly what his intentions were regarding her niece's future, which was a question he answered directly in return: that Augusta was his wife and his partner and his home, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life making sure she was glad she had come to Dusty Creek. Harriet looked at him for a long time and then said, "Elias would have liked you," which was, Augusta told Joseph later, the highest compliment Harriet was capable of bestowing. She stayed 2 weeks and left on good terms, and in her bag when she departed was a folded letter from Augusta that said, among other things, that she was happy, genuinely and specifically happy, in the way she had not known she was missing until she found it. The winter of 1881 going into 1882 was cold but not brutal, which in Texas terms means it froze hard in January and thawed quickly in February, and the cattle came through it better than some years. Joseph and Augusta built the habits of a shared life through those months, the texture of mornings and evenings and Sunday dinners, and the particular peace of two people who have found their right weather in each other. In February, Augusta told Joseph she was expecting a child. He was in the barn when she told him, checking on a horse that had come in for boarding and had developed a mild lameness that required monitoring. She came to the barn door and stood in the light and said it very directly, because she was Augusta and directness was how she worked. He turned from the horse and looked at her, and the expression on his face was so immediate and unguarded that she felt it physically, like warmth. He crossed the barn in 4 strides and took her face in his hands, which were large and rough and careful, and he said her name and then could not immediately say anything else, which was all right because she understood. She said, "Well, the ranch is going to need more repairs." He laughed, which released whatever had been held in his chest, and he put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and they stood in the cold barn smell of hay and horses, with the February light coming thin through the boards. And it was one of those moments that does not need to be remembered, because it has already become permanent in a way that is not about memory at all. Cletus Dre, upon being told, said that he had seen it coming since April, which was his way of expressing joy, and then went to check the fence, which was his way of giving them privacy. Spring came back to Dusty Creek in the way that spring comes to places that have earned it through genuine winter, which is to say it came extravagantly. Bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush and the mesquite breaking into green along the creek, and the whole hill country announcing that it had survived again and was pleased about it. Augusta's pregnancy was unremarkable in the best sense, which is to say it proceeded without complication, which was not something you could count on in 1882, and which both she and Joseph understood was a mercy. Mrs. Calloway visited regularly with advice and practical assistance. Ruth Prescott began making small garments with the same focused attention she brought to everything. The doctor in Dusty Creek, a serious young man named Dr. Marsh, who had come from Philadelphia 3 years ago and had adapted to Texas medicine with impressive flexibility, kept careful track of her progress. Joseph read everything available to him about childbirth and infant care, which in 1882 was not a great deal, and what he could not read he asked Dr. Marsh about directly, which the doctor found both unusual and admirable in a prospective father. Solomon seemed to understand that something significant was happening. He had grown particularly attentive to Augusta in the mornings, pressing his forehead gently against her shoulder when she came to the corral, and standing very still in a way that was different from his ordinary stillness. In July of 1882, exactly 1 year after their wedding, Augusta delivered a boy. They named him Elias Joseph Covington, the first name for the grandfather he would never know, the second for the father who was standing in the next room with his hat in his hands, absolutely unable to think about anything except the sound of a baby crying for the first time, which was the most extraordinary sound he had ever heard in his life. "Doctor." Marsh came out of the bedroom and said both mother and child were fine, which were the words Joseph had been waiting for, and he went in and saw Augusta holding the baby with the exhausted and illuminated expression of someone who has just accomplished something massive and knows it. And he sat on the edge of the bed and put one careful hand on his son's head and said very quietly, "Elias, hello." Augusta watched Joseph look at their son and felt something she could not name, something that was beyond love and beyond gratitude, and had to do with the rightness of a thing, the way things arrive when they are supposed to arrive, the way a horse comes home. Little Elias Covington was a loud and vigorous baby from the start, which Cletus said meant he had good lungs and probably strong opinions, a prediction that turned out to be accurate in both respects. He grew into a toddler who was fascinated by the horses and completely unafraid of them, which gave both his parents simultaneous pride and anxiety. Solomon, in particular, was patient with the boy in the way that certain animals are patient with children, allowing liberties that he would not have tolerated from an adult, and watching the small human with what could only be described as fond attention. Augusta and Joseph fell deeper into each other across those years in the way that love matures when it has time and shared experience to grow in, which is to say it became less like a feeling and more like a fact, something you did not question because its truth was too fundamental for questioning. There were hard seasons, seasons when the cattle prices dropped and the rain failed. A terrible summer in 1885 when a fever swept through Dusty Creek, and they kept little Elias inside for 6 weeks, and Joseph rode twice to the next town for medicine, and Augusta did not sleep properly for a month. There were joyful seasons too, seasons of abundance and laughter, and the particular pleasure of watching something you built together grow and strengthen. In the fall of 1884, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Clara Rose Covington, after no one in particular but because the name suited her, which became apparent almost immediately. Clara was quieter than Elias from the beginning, with a watchful quality that reminded Augusta of Joseph, and dark eyes that looked out at the world with a thoughtful steadiness that seemed to understand more than it said. The ranch grew steadily over those years, not dramatically, but in the way of something well tended. Joseph brought on a second hired hand, a young man named Tomas who had come north from across the Rio Grande and who was extraordinarily good with horses. Augusta's vegetable enterprise had expanded to include a small greenhouse addition to the barn's east wall, a practical innovation that required considerable negotiation with the local building materials available in 1884, but which produced tomatoes and herbs through the winter, and added both to the household table and to the small income Augusta kept carefully tracked in a ledger she had bought from Mrs. Calloway's store. Solomon, who was getting old in the way that horses get old, which is to say slowly and with dignity, remained the presiding spirit of the corral. He had developed a particular friendship with Clara, who at 2 years old would sit on the fence and talk to him in an earnest, largely unintelligible way that he listened to with complete attention. Augusta watched this from the kitchen window sometimes and thought about her father, about the way Augusta Baker had said that Solomon had more wisdom than most men, and felt the truth of it in her chest like a warm coal. One October evening in 1885, Joseph and Augusta sat on the porch after the children were in bed, the way they often did when the evenings were cool enough to be pleasant. The sky over the ridge was doing something magnificent with stars that it could only do far from any city, which meant in all directions from Dusty Creek it was doing it spectacularly. Augusta said, "I have been thinking about my father." Joseph said, "Tell me," she said. "I think he would have liked this." Not the specific life of it, because he was a man who needed to keep moving, but he would have liked knowing I found it. He always worried, you know. He used to say in his letters that he hoped I would not inherit his restlessness, that I would find somewhere to anchor. He did not know how much he worried about it until I found the letters he had written to Harriet after he died, and she shared them with me. Joseph said, "You are the least restless person I know." She said, "I was restless for a while, after he died. I was moving all the time without knowing what I was moving toward." She paused. "And then I found Solomon, and I found you, and I stopped." He reached over and took her hand, which was something he had done thousands of times by now, and it still felt like a choice, like something he was doing deliberately rather than habitually, which was one of the things that made her love him the way she did. He said, "I count myself among the luckiest men in Texas, and Texas has a considerable number of men who consider themselves lucky." She said, "You kept a horse for over 3 years." He said, "I did." She said, "On the off chance that someone would come." He said, "On the certain knowledge that someone would." She said, "How were you certain?" He said, "I was not technically. But I decided to behave as though I was, which amounts to the same thing." She turned and looked at him in the starlight, this man she had found at the end of a borrowed mule's road, and she thought that there were all kinds of patience in the world, and that the most remarkable kind was not the patience of waiting without knowing why, but the patience of acting as though you knew what you were waiting for before you had any evidence. That was something she did not have a proper word for, but which she recognized as a kind of faith in its oldest meaning. She said, "Joseph Covington, I would choose you again. If I arrived again tomorrow not knowing anything and you were standing in that yard, I would choose you again." He said very quietly, "Augusta." "So would I." They sat on the porch together for a long time, in the good silence of two people who have found the right place to be. In the spring of 1886, Dusty Creek got a new schoolteacher, a young woman named Miss Helen Park, who was 22 and had come from Missouri, and was adjusting to Texas with the determined good humor of someone who has decided to succeed at whatever they have undertaken. She was bright and capable, and had the particular gift of making children feel that learning was interesting rather than compulsory. And Elias Covington, who was nearly 4, was already too young for her school, but was being prepared by Augusta with a patience and intention that would serve him well when the time came. It was Miss Helen Park who, in the fall of 1886, brought to Augusta's attention that there were 2 children in the outer settlements who were not being schooled at all. Children of a Mexican family named Salazar who ran cattle on the South Range, and who had not been offered a place in the schoolhouse, because of a bias that Miss Park found both ugly and practically counterproductive. She raised this with Augusta directly because she had already tried the school board and been met with the particular resistance of men who have confused custom with principle. Augusta went to Joseph that evening. He said, "Tell me," she told him. He was quiet for a while in the way that meant he was thinking fully rather than just reacting, and then he said, "The Salazar family has been on that South Range longer than half the ranchers in this county. Their boy Rodrigo helped me pull a calf out of the creek last winter without being asked and without expecting anything for it." She said, "Yes." He said, "I will speak to the board." She said, "They may not listen." He said, "They may not, but they will have heard." Joseph Covington was not a large man in the way of men who announce themselves loudly, but he was the kind of man that people in a small community listened to because his word had proven reliable over years, and because he said things rarely enough that, when he said them, people paid attention. He made his case to the school board at the next meeting, which Augusta attended, and he made it without anger but with the specific gravity of a man who is stating a simple moral truth and intends to be heard. There was resistance, as Augusta had predicted. There were arguments about tradition and practicality and what was appropriate, which were the usual arguments that people make when they mean something uglier and are too careful to say it plainly. Joseph heard them out and then said, simply, that a school that did not educate all the children in its community was failing its purpose, and that he believed the board members were capable of understanding that, and that he would like to give them the opportunity to demonstrate it. The vote was 3-2 in favor of inclusion, which was not unanimous but was sufficient. The Salazar children came to school in October of 1886, and Miss Helen Park received them with exactly the matter-of-fact warmth she gave every other student, which was the best possible way to handle the arrival of something that should have been obvious from the start. Augusta squeezed Joseph's hand when they left the meeting, and he said, "It should not have required a meeting." She said, "No, but it is done now." He said, "For now." She said, "Yes, for now, and we keep going." He said, "Yes, we keep going." This was another thing about Joseph Covington that Augusta understood over the years. He was not a man who expected the world to be just, but he was a man who believed it was worth pushing toward justice anyway, the way you might push toward a horizon you could not reach, understanding that the direction mattered even if the destination was beyond any one person's lifetime. Solomon died in the autumn of 1887, on a warm evening in October when the light was doing its amber and gold performance over the limestone ridge. He died quietly, which was appropriate for a horse of his temperament, and Augusta found him in the morning when she went to the corral, and she sat with him for a long time before she told Joseph. They buried him at the edge of the pasture, which was unconventional but felt right, and Augusta put a hand on the turned earth afterward and said something quietly that was between her and her father and the horse who had connected them. And Joseph stood close behind her with his hand on her shoulder and did not say anything because there was nothing to say, and he understood that. Little Elias, who was 5 and deeply solemn about the matter, asked where Solomon had gone. Augusta said that he had gone to be with her father, which satisfied Elias profoundly, as though the rightness of this arrangement was self-evident. Clara, at 3, patted the earth very gently and then ran after a butterfly, which was also appropriate. Joseph bought a bay mare that fall, a good-natured animal named Juniper, and she became the children's horse in the way that Solomon had been Augusta's father's horse, a steady and patient presence around whom the life of the ranch organized itself. The years moved through the latter half of the 1880s with the quality of time that is well occupied, which is to say they moved both quickly and fully. Dusty Creek grew by small degrees, a new hardware store, a second saloon that the Reverend objected to and the town ignored, a new family of farmers from Illinois who settled east of the limestone ridge and who came to Sunday dinners at the Covington Ranch twice, and then began hosting their own, the Hoffmans, who had 3 children and a talent for music that meant their evenings were conducted at a higher volume than most. Elias Covington started school in 1887 and took to it immediately, especially to anything involving numbers, a talent that his teacher identified early and his father regarded with the particular pride of a man who is not especially talented with numbers himself. Clara followed 2 years later and distinguished herself in reading with the same quiet determination she brought to everything. Joseph and Augusta had one more child, a second son named August Thomas Covington, born in the summer of 1889, named August because Augusta thought it was funny and Joseph agreed that it was funny, and they both decided that funny was a reasonable basis for a name. Young August, called Tom by everyone including himself as soon as he could express a preference, was the loudest of the 3 children, the most immediate, and the one most likely to be found in some situation that required explanation. The ranch by 1890 was a different thing from what it had been when Augusta arrived. The house had been expanded twice, once for the children and once for a proper parlor that Augusta had decided was necessary for reasons of both practicality and morale. The barn was large and well kept. The corral held 6 horses regularly. The vegetable operation had grown into a proper kitchen, garden, and greenhouse arrangement that supplied the ranch and sold surplus steadily to Mrs. Calloway's store and to 2 neighboring farms. Cletus Dre still worked the ranch, and was still wrong about the weather, and was still right about cattle, and was in his 60s now and moving more slowly but no less thoughtfully. He had developed a particular relationship with young Elias that involved sitting on the fence and discussing the probable futures of the cattle with a seriousness that treated the boy as a genuine colleague, which was exactly the right approach for a child of Elias' disposition. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, in July of 1891, Joseph and Augusta sat on the porch after the children were in bed, which was a scene they had repeated hundreds of times by now, and which had not become ordinary in the way that repetition sometimes drains meaning from things, but had instead become more itself, the way a path becomes more defined the more often it is walked. He had gotten her a gift, which was a new leather journal because she had been keeping her observations and accounts in a journal for years and had filled the last one. She had gotten him a new edition of Twain, the first part of his autobiography that was available, because Joseph had read everything Twain had written and had a particular appreciation for the man's combination of comedy and truth. They sat with their respective gifts, and the evening came down around the ridge in its unhurried way, and Augusta said, 10 years. He said, 10 years. She said, I came here for a horse. He said, I know. She said, I got considerably more than a horse. He said, so did I. She looked at him. You were not expecting anything. He said, no, but I had kept myself open to it, which is perhaps different from expecting it. She said, tell me what you mean. He said, I think I had been living in a way that left room for something to arrive, not specifically, not impatiently, but I had not closed off the possibility of something arriving, the way a man can close off possibilities when he has been alone long enough to decide he prefers it. He paused. And then Solomon came, and I took care of him, and 3 years later you came, and I understood what I had been keeping room for. She said, Joseph. He said, it sounds like a pretty story. She said, it sounds true. He said, it is both. She moved closer to him on the bench, the way she had done on hundreds of evenings, and he put his arm around her, the way he had done on hundreds of evenings, and it was not dramatic. It was not a gesture in a book. It was simply two people at the end of a good day of a good life, sitting in the warmth of what they had built together, which was a quiet kind of grandeur that did not need to be observed by anyone except themselves to be completely real. The stars came out over the Texas sky in their extravagant numbers, and the wind off the ridge was cool and smelled of grass and limestone, and the particular scent of late Texas summer that has no name but is unmistakable if you know it. And the house behind them was full of the soft sounds of children sleeping, and the barn had its horses settled for the night. And somewhere out at the edge of the east pasture, there was a small patch of turned earth where a palomino horse named Solomon lay. And the grass over it was very green and very quiet. Augusta said, I want to tell you something. He said, tell me. She said, I think about that first day. When I came up the road on Harriet's mule and I saw Solomon in the corral, and I got off that mule before I had even decided to get off, because everything in me recognized that I was somewhere important. I did not know why yet. I thought it was just the horse. He said, and now, she said, now I think the horse was the door. You were what was on the other side. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, your father named him well. She said, Solomon. He said, wisdom. A horse with the wisdom to bring the right people together. She laughed softly. My father would have loved that reading of it. He said, I know. I think he would have loved many things about this life. She said, he would have loved you. He said, I hope so. I hope he knows. She said, I believe he does. They sat until the stars had wheeled a full quarter of the way around their arc, and the night had settled deep and full around the ranch. And then Augusta said she was going in, and Joseph said he would be a moment, and she went through the screen door into the warm interior of the house, and he sat alone on the porch for a minute or two longer, the way he sometimes did, looking out at the dark shape of the ridge against the star-filled sky. He was thinking, as he sometimes did in these quiet moments, about what it meant that a riderless palomino horse had come to his corral on a cold November morning in 1878, and about what it meant that he had kept the horse, and about what it meant that the keeping of the horse had become the chain of events that led, eventually, to everything. He was not a man who believed the universe arranged things deliberately. But he was a man who believed that when something arrived at your gate, exhausted and riderless, you had an obligation to take care of it and to wait and see what it meant. He was a man who believed that waiting with intention was not the same as waiting without purpose. He had waited, and Augusta had come, and here was the life he was living, wide and full and better than anything he had specifically planned. He got up from the porch bench and went inside. Augusta was in the kitchen, and she had put the kettle on, which was a thing she did sometimes when the evening had been too good for either of them to go immediately to sleep. She handed him a cup of tea, and he sat across from her at the kitchen table where they had been sitting together for 10 years, and they drank their tea in the comfortable quiet of two people who had found the very particular shelter of each other. He said, "I am glad you came." She said, "I am glad you kept him." He said, "So am I," and that was the whole of it, contained in 3 sentences, the long arc of everything. A man who kept a horse because it was the right thing to do. A woman who traveled 3 days on a borrowed mule because something was worth finding. And all of it, the 10 years and the 3 children and the ranch and the town and the 10,000 ordinary extraordinary days, growing from that one decision. To wait, to keep faith with the idea that something you were holding in trust had an owner somewhere who would eventually come. He had been right. She had been worth the wait. She had been, as it turned out, worth every single one of the 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days, and all the years that followed after. The kettle's steam rose in the lamplight, and the children slept in their rooms, and the horses stood quiet in the barn, and the Texas night spread wide and deep and generous over the limestone ridge and the pasture and the small patch of green earth at the pasture's edge. And the ranch that was Covington, that was Baker and Covington together, breathed its steady breath in the dark, alive and real and utterly, completely home. In the years that followed the turn of the decade into the 1890s, Joseph and Augusta found that the life they had built continued to reveal new dimensions they had not anticipated. This was the thing about a well-made life, that it kept on opening, kept on presenting new rooms that you had not known were there. Elias, who had grown tall and serious and gifted with numbers, announced at 11 that he wanted to study engineering, a word he had encountered in a newspaper and pursued with the tenacity that characterized everything he did. Joseph found him books through the mail order catalog from a publisher in New York, dry and technical volumes that Elias read cover to cover, and then read again. And Augusta watched her son and thought about her father's restlessness, and understood that restlessness in a child could become direction in a man if you gave it the right material to work with. Clara had become a reader of extraordinary appetite, consuming everything available to her in Dusty Creek, which was not inconsiderable given that both her parents had always maintained a serious shelf, and then beginning to write things of her own, small stories at first, then longer ones. Augusta found Clara's notebooks one afternoon by accident when she was putting laundry away, and she sat on the edge of Clara's bed and read several pages with growing astonishment, because her daughter at 10 was writing with a clarity and confidence that was already remarkable. She talked to Joseph about it that evening, showing him the pages. He read them carefully and said, "She is going to be a writer." Augusta said, "She does not know it yet." He said, "She knows it, she just has not named it." Young Tom, who was the chaos of the 3, was nonetheless becoming an impressive horseman, which Tomas the hired hand attributed to a natural affinity and a complete absence of fear, which were indeed the 2 main requirements. Tom could ride before he could reliably read, a fact that gave Augusta mixed feelings and Joseph considerable pride, and by the time he was 5, he was helping Tomas with the horses in a capacity that was more hindrance than help but was nonetheless genuine. The 1890s brought changes to Dusty Creek as they brought changes to Texas generally, which was the slow, uneven arrival of what people were beginning to call progress, which meant telegraph lines and talk of railroad extensions, and the particular disruption of an old order that happens when the world expands its definition of itself. Joseph watched these changes with the careful attention of a man who understands that progress is neither purely good nor purely bad but simply arriving, and that the skill is in deciding what to hold and what to release. He held the land. He held the horses. He held the way of working that was honest and direct and relied on what a man could do with his hands and his word. He released some of the older habits of isolation that had characterized his early years on the ranch, opening the place up to more neighbors, more occasions, more of the community life that Augusta had always naturally gravitated toward. He had come to understand, the social architecture of their life together. She knew everyone in Dusty Creek by their first and last names and a meaningful detail about each of them. And she remembered things and followed up on things and wove the fabric of community with the same practical attention she brought to the vegetable garden, understanding that both required regular tending and produced things of genuine value. Mrs. Calloway retired from the general store in 1892 and sold it to a young couple from San Antonio, and Augusta organized a farewell dinner for her that the whole town attended. And Mrs. Calloway, who was not a woman who cried easily or often, cried at the toast Augusta gave, which was specific and warm and exactly right. In the spring of 1893, Joseph had a health scare, a chest pain that brought Dr. Marsh out to the ranch in haste and kept Joseph in bed for 4 days, while Augusta managed the ranch with Cletus and Tomas, and an iron composure that cost her considerably more than she let anyone see. Dr. Marsh determined that the pain was muscular rather than cardiac, the result of lifting a section of timber without adequate help in a fence repair project, and that rest and care were the prescription. Augusta sat with Joseph on the 3rd day when he was restless and frustrated by the inactivity, and she said, "You are not allowed to die. I am making this explicitly clear." He said, "Augusta." She said, "You have children who need you and a ranch that needs you and I need you and I will not have it." He said, "I have pulled a muscle." She said, "I know, but I am saying it anyway." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her face, which had the particular quality of someone who has been afraid and has converted the fear into declaration because declaration is more useful. He said, "I am not going anywhere." She said, "Good." He said, "I mean it." She said, "I know you mean it." "Joseph, I arrived in this town with nothing but grief and a borrowed mule, and I am not going back to that." He reached out and took her hand and said, "Augusta, you will never go back to that. I promise you that." She let herself believe it, because she had learned over 12 years of marriage that his promises were the most reliable currency she had ever encountered. He was up and working within the week, and the fence got repaired properly, and Augusta watched him from the kitchen window with the complicated emotion of a woman who knows she loves someone more than she can entirely afford to, and has decided to afford it anyway. Cletus Dre retired in 1894, at the age of 66, which he did with significant protest, insisting he still had years of usefulness in him, which was probably true. But his knees had begun to require more consideration than ranch work permitted, and Joseph sat with him one evening and talked about it man to man, and Cletus eventually agreed, though with the expression of someone who considers retirement an insult to his character. He stayed in Dusty Creek, in a small house on the edge of town that Joseph helped him secure, and he came to Sunday dinners at the ranch without exception for the rest of his years, and his opinions about weather were no more accurate than they had ever been, and his opinions about cattle were no less sound, and he lived to see Elias Covington leave for his engineering studies in the fall of 1895. And he told the boy at the station that the world needed men who built things, and that he should build things well, which Elias took seriously because he took everything seriously. Augusta cried when Elias left, quietly and privately in the kitchen, and Joseph found her there and did not say anything but stood with her in the kitchen until she was done, and then she straightened and said, "He is ready," and Joseph said, "He is," and that was that. Clara was 13 in 1895 and already taller than most women in Dusty Creek, and reading at a level that required the mail order catalog to be working overtime. Augusta had begun corresponding with a woman in Austin who ran a small literary society, and through this correspondence had obtained several books for Clara that were not available through the regular channels, and Clara had begun writing letters of her own to this woman, who responded with gratifying seriousness and told Augusta that her daughter had a genuine and considerable talent. Tom, who was 6 and entirely himself, had taken a rooster personally and was conducting a vendetta against it that the rest of the family found both exhausting and secretly funny. The rooster won most of the engagements, but Tom was persistent. Joseph said that the boy had his mother's determination, which Augusta said was both a compliment and an excuse. In the long evenings of 1895 and 1896, when the children were becoming their own people with their own particular trajectories, Joseph and Augusta found that they had come to a new kind of ease with each other that was richer than what they had had in the beginning, which was not to say the beginning had been lesser, only that depth accumulates. They knew each other now in the way of people who have seen each other in ordinary conditions and extraordinary ones, in joy and in fear, and in mundane annoyance, and in grief and in sickness, and in the particular comedy of daily life that requires a witness. They still sat on the porch in the evenings. The bench had been replaced twice. The porch itself had been extended in 1888 and screened in 1892 against the summer insects, a modification that Augusta had proposed, and Joseph had resisted until the first evening on the screened porch when he admitted she had been entirely right. She said, "I am frequently right." He said, "You are. I am working on recognizing it faster." She said, "You are improving." He said, "15 years of practice." She said, 14, we married in 1881. He said, "I count from when you arrived." She looked at him. He was looking at the ridge the way he did, with the calm attention he brought to landscapes and to her and to the things he loved, which were all of a piece for him, things worth watching carefully. She said, "Joseph Covington." He said, "Augusta Covington." She said, "I love you." He turned from the ridge and looked at her directly, as he always did when something mattered, and he said, "I love you, today and yesterday and the day before that. I love you in every direction." She reached over and put her hand on his. He turned his palm up and held it. The ridge was going amber and gold in the evening light, the way it had always done, the way it would go on doing long after them. And the Texas sky was enormous, and the stars were beginning their patient arrangement overhead. And somewhere in the barn, Juniper the mare shifted in her stall and settled. And in the house behind them, Tom could be heard arguing with Clara about something that would be forgotten by morning. And the Covington ranch breathed its steady breath in the turning evening. And it was entirely, thoroughly, permanently home. This was the whole of it. This was the thing that had grown from a man's patient decision to keep a horse that was not his own, on the faith that the world contained people who would come looking for what they had lost, and the faith proved correct, that when they arrived they might find more than they came for. Augusta Baker had come for Solomon and found a life. Joseph Covington had kept a horse and found his reason for all the patience. And the years went on after that. Good years and difficult years and years that were simply years, and all of them together, the whole long accumulation of them, amounted to something that had no word large enough to contain it, but which both of them felt every morning when they woke up in the same house in the same life they had built from a borrowed mule and a palomino horse, and 3 years of faithful waiting. It was, they would have both said if asked, which they rarely were, because people who are truly happy do not often stop to explain it exactly enough. It was, in fact, considerably more than enough. It was, in all the ways that matter and last, everything.